Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Dr. Bench Ansfield is a historian of racial capitalism, the carceral state, and 20th century U.S. cities. They hold a PhD in American Studies from Yale University, our alma mater, and is currently assistant professor of history at Temple University. Prior to their time at Temple, they were the ACLS and postdoctoral fellow at the Dartmouth Society of Fellows, and an American Democracy Fellow at Harvard's Charles Warren Center for American Studies and American History. And their achievements have been remarkable for someone who's pretty early on in their career. Among three other prizes, their dissertation won the 2022, they're a little bit younger than that, Alan Nevins Prize for the best dissertation in American history from the Society of American Historians. Their peer-reviewed articles have appeared in the Journal of American History, American Quarterly, and Antipode. Bench has also worked as a researcher on the Decade of Fire documentary by PBS. And most recently, Barnes & Noble has named the book, some parts of which you will hear about today, one of the top and most anticipated nonfiction books of 2025. So this is a really big deal. It'll come out on August 19th of this summer. Beyond this, Bench is just an incredible person, someone who I very much credit with helping me to think capaciously and creatively about American history, and also just a really good friend when I was at Yale, and I think it was the first night that I showed up to figure out what is this grad school thing that we're going to do. Bench picked me up and took me out to some pizza, and the rest is history, and here we are. So thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to hear about your work and this talk, its relationship to California. And thank you all for being here as well. Round of applause for Bench.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And thank you just in general to the inimitable Dr. Pedro Regalado for being a mensch among mensches. You all are so lucky that you get to hang out with him on the regular. Thank you also to Alexandros Orphanides and the entire Black and Otherwise Geographies working group. We had a really generative discussion yesterday. And thanks to Dean Messenger Arms and Tina Lathia for coordinating all of the arrangements for the talk. Today I'm going to be presenting research from my forthcoming book, Born in Flames, The Business of Arson and the Remaking of the American City, which is out on August 19th. The book centers around the wave of landlord arson that coursed through the Bronx in the 1970s, though its scope stretches beyond that period in that place. In some ways, the story begins here in California in 1965. That year, the Watts uprising set South Central Los Angeles ablaze for 6 days, announcing a new age of Black revolt against police violence and systematic inequality. It also inaugurated a new era in the history of property insurance. So in the aftermath of the uprising, the insurance market in LA's Black neighborhoods collapsed entirely. And it would take years before insurers re-entered those areas. And the vehicle for that process goes by a name that will be familiar to many of you, the California Fair Plan, which has occupied headlines nonstop over the past few months since the outbreak of the Eaton and the Palisades fires earlier this year, and even before that over the last few years. As the state's insurer of last resort, the Fair Plan carries the insurance for large swaths of the burned areas, and its exponential growth in recent years is a function of the insurance industry's dramatic withdrawal from the California market over the past few years. Since 2022, State Farm, Nationwide, Allstate, and many other firms have seized or severely curtailed their underwriting of the California market. Something you all know and feel probably. That left the Fair Plan acutely overexposed to the fire's still mounting losses. Earlier in February, the Fair Plan came close to insolvency before receiving $1 billion bailout, much of which will be shouldered by homeowners and renters. In the hundreds of articles that have been published about the California Fair Plan in the last few months, there's only a small handful that even nod to its origins. Indeed, the California Fair Plan of 2025 is almost exclusively associated with wildfire risk, right? But it's the byproduct of a very different type of conflagration, urban rebellion. So what we have is a property insurance program that was designed for, quote, riot-prone areas, now standing as the only source of indemnity for those vast geographies of fire and flood that seem to grow only vaster with every passing year, right? Today's talk, Racial Capitalism in the Burning Years, the 1970s Bronx in 3 frames, grapples with that fiery inheritance by tracing the 1968 creation of the FAIR plans and the wave of insurance arson that followed. The talk unfolds across 3 frames. First, I'll lay out the questions that seeded the project and give an overview of the book and some of its objectives. Then I'll dive in deeper with a specific case study that captures some of the stakes of the project, and then with the time we have left, I'll return to some of the broad questions that the project tackles and how they shift our understanding of race, capitalism in U.S. cities. So I want to begin with the most elemental object of the 20th century built environment, the humble brick. The Bronx, as we know it, a bedroom borough housing New York City's workers, was constructed with common bricks just like this. The vast majority of its housing is comprised of fireproof walk-up apartments built in the 19-teens and 20s out of bricks and mortar. One of the major draws for moving up to the Bronx for an emergent, mostly white middle class or aspiring middle class was the relative safety of these buildings compared to the fire traps in, say, the Lower East Side. Zoom forward half a century to the 1970s, in those same fireproof buildings we're suffering the most protracted and most destructive conflagration in the history of the nation's largest city. Around that time, Roberto Ramirez was in the 6th grade in the Longwood section of the Bronx. This is one of the epicenters of the wreckage. His new art teacher, Tim Rollins, instructed him and his classmates to go into the surrounding neighborhood in search of found objects. And Ramirez came upon a fallen brick that sat in an abandoned lot, staring up at him like a question mark. The assignment was to envision the object as something else, and Ramirez made the imaginative leap of picturing the brick as a building that was still standing. He took a paintbrush to its rough exterior, and after carefully outlining the matchbox windows, he filled their frames with fire. Not all of them, though, only the windows at the top. He knew that in the Bronx, fire started at the top. Ramirez's technique quickly caught on amongst the other 6th graders, and before long, the class had produced a series of 50 flaming miniatures. They drew what they knew, life in a firestorm. The family of another student, John Mendoza, had been burned out of their apartment 3 times by arsonists, an experience as calamitous as it was routine. But what the students were structurally prevented from knowing, beyond the rumors and the hearsay that children can absorb, was why fires were so prevalent in their neighborhood. For answers, they went to their new art teacher, Tim Rollins. He's a white conceptual artist with ties to the downtown art scene. He was an outsider to the neighborhood. He had basically no answers for them, but he did lead them down to the fire department in hopes of an explanation. They go down to the nearest fire department asking, why are there so many fires? But even the firefighters offered only vague and conflicting replies, and the students left the station dejected. Rollins saw in that mystery a potential muse. He asked the students to inscribe a plausible explanation on the bricks and marveled, quote, we got 70 different reasons. Ramirez, for one, laid the blame at the door of the tenants who were behind on rent, inscribing rent late on the building's roof. Other students claimed that junkies burned the buildings down. So basically, absent a coherent framework for the burning of their neighborhood, the students were left with concrete bricks in lieu of concrete answers. The process of becoming rubble had stripped the bricks of their structural context, unframing them. What the students were trying to do was to give the bricks a history, however imprecise that history might have been. Their effort became known as the Brick Series, and it was the first in a decades-long collaboration called Kids of Survival, or KOS. One of these bricks now sits in the permanent collection of the Whitney Museum. So I begin with the story of Roberto Ramirez and the Brick Series because it raises some questions that I still find haunting. Why were the students left juggling 70 different reasons for this conflagration that had upended their lives and engulfed their neighborhoods, right? The mystery behind how this could be a mystery at all is this talk's point of departure. How could the toll from the firestorm have been so colossal when its source was so opaque? Turns out that it takes a full book to unravel the mystery. I'll only be able to sketch the broad outlines for y'all today. The book is propelled by three questions that I ask in sequence. Why did cities go up in flames in these years? How were their fires extinguished? And what arose in their ashes? Together, these three seemingly simple lines of inquiry can cast new light on the restructuring of the built environment and its political economy over the last 5 decades. Now, arson might seem like an obscure or like a fringe phenomenon upon which to try to reconceptualize the history of U.S. cities and race and capitalism. And 10 years ago, I probably would have agreed with you. But hundreds of hours of oral histories, 14 archives later, I changed my tune. So the book positions the 1970s arson wave as a singular window into late 20th century transformations in racial capitalism, or the entanglement between racial hierarchy and the imperatives of capitalist accumulation. So let me explain first by considering the politics of historical memory. Between 1968 and the early 1980s, a wave of landlord arson laid waste to cities across the United States, destroying large portions home to poor neighborhoods of color. From Philly to Phoenix, hundreds of thousands of units burned in these years. And the scope of this history is on view in this map, where the states in red all saw the formation of anti-arson organizations or task forces over the course of the 1970s. One such task force was organized in San Francisco in I think 1974. A different one was organized in Oakland a few years later. But incredibly, the arson wave was left to smolder for nearly a decade before attracting the type of media coverage or governmental response befitting a phenomenon of this scale. And in the years since, historians have similarly neglected the burning of the nation's cities. In the absence of critical scholarship, I turn to the power of historical memory. I argue that a major reason for the lack of state media and scholarly response is that the uprisings of the 1960s have obscured the landlord torch fires of the 1970s. These earlier uprisings, of course, were born of Black and Puerto Rican outrage over the intransigence of institutionalized white supremacy, even in the face of the civil rights movement at its heyday. But whether measured in dollars or lives lost, the destruction wrought by the uprisings of the 60s pales in comparison to the fires of the 1970s. In 1967, the most violent year of the rebellions, the number of dead were counted in the tens, and the insurable losses were less than 75 million. By contrast, at least 500 people died annually of arson throughout the 1970s, and by 1980, it was estimated to be taking a $15 billion annual toll. So these are crude and fraught barometers of historical significance, and I'm not trying to downplay the magnitude and significance of the uprisings. But I do want to consider what's at stake for historical memory when these stories of Black uprising were to conceal this structural violence inflicted upon Black and brown neighborhoods, primarily by landlords, over the course of the subsequent decade. As I show in part 1 of the book, the fires of the 1970s were lit not for protest, but for profit, most of which flowed into the bank accounts of landlords in the form of insurance payouts. At the center of the study is this untold history of the racially stratified property insurance market, this key force in the making of U.S. urban inequality. Although physical science would have it that fire requires only oxygen, heat, and fuel to ignite, the crucial ingredient in the 70s was state-sponsored fire insurance, initiated by federal fiat in response to the uprisings. So the study chronicles how increased access to this federally sponsored fire insurance, when paired with state cutbacks and ongoing redlining by mortgage lenders, incentivized landlords to burn their buildings on a vast scale. Now, the availability of fire insurance merits some explanation. A generation of historians and social scientists has skillfully documented the phenomenon known as redlining, or the state-sanctioned denial of credit and financial services in communities of color since the 1930s. That landlords were able to freely procure insurance coverage in the 1970s would seem to cut against this received wisdom, right? Like, put another way, the availability of insurance seems to contradict what we thought we knew about the where and when of redlining. Born in Flames solves that historical puzzle by tracing the evolution of the property insurance market in the post-war era. The racially stratified property insurance market was formalized after 1945 when comprehensive homeowners policies were introduced in the burgeoning suburbs while central cities began to be redlined. It wasn't until the 1960s uprisings that insurance access began to permeate poor neighborhoods of color, and here's how that happened. Facing the possibility of wholesale insurance withdrawal from its central cities in 1968, an offshoot of the Federal Kerner Commission established a program to bail out the insurance industry, but it did so in the discourse, like in the vernacular of the civil rights movement. In return for what was called federal riot reinsurance, insurers agreed to end redlining practices by offering this new line of property insurance called the Fair Plan. Yet despite situating themselves within the movement for racial justice, these new public-private insurance plans were exorbitantly priced, really only affordable to those with easy access to capital, and that mostly meant absentee landlords. So instead of redistributing access to insurance in ways that was meaningful to the residents of formerly redlined neighborhoods, the program set the stage for further ruin. In part 2 of the book, I show how these new state-sponsored insurance plans did succeed in injecting insurance access into poor neighborhoods of color, but this occurred against the backdrop of ongoing redlining, social service cutbacks, fiscal crises at all levels of government. And the sum of these forces was what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandonment, with particular financialized characteristics. This ad by the Travelers from 1977 is basically the entire book summarized in like a little bit of advertising copy. Unfortunately, the Travelers did not grant me permission to put this in the book, although fair use laws apparently permit me to take just the header. So it's very awkwardly like separated from the rest of it and published in there. Landlords resorted to arson not necessarily out of malice, but really out of like financial prudence. The buildings had become most valuable to them after they had gone up in flames. While attending to the national and the transnational sweep of this history, the book zeroes in on the Bronx, known in these years as the arson capital of the world. The Bronx lost approximately 20% of its total housing stock to fire and abandonment between 1970 and 1981. So it's in the ballpark of 100,000 units of housing. That's like New Haven, Connecticut, or Berkeley burning down twice over. Destruction of that scale, unfathomable though it might be, shouldn't be mobilized toward a Bronx exceptionalism, as is common in the kind of rare remembrances of this history. This is happening in cities all across the country, in every region. Los Angeles experienced a 500% rise in arson just between 1975 and 1980. In a decade that saw the U.S. swear off state-sponsored urban renewal, the arson wave was, in a sense, a free market slum clearance program, right, that was driven by these abiding racial logics. And like the better remembered urban renewal programs of the 50s and 60s, this one would also precipitate massive displacement, community rupture, and precarity. But as I show in part 3, it provoked little official outcry until the tail end of the 1970s. That absence of government intervention sparked a groundswell of interracial community organizing throughout the borough. Dozens of anti-arson organizations formed in the space of a few years, and their efforts ultimately succeeded in stemming the tide of the burnings. To walk into one of these anti-arson organization meetings in the mid-70s Bronx was really to witness transformations in community organizing that would manifest nationwide over the following decades. From the embers arose a host of new organizational models: community development corporations, urban environmental organizations, sweat equity groups, and grassroots real estate initiatives. And the politics of these groups could vary dramatically. So one such group was the Bronx Frontier, an early environmental org that collected the rubble from torched buildings and turned it into compost, which it then sold at Bloomingdale's. The group's call to green the Bronx was controversial. It evoked planned shrinkage policies that cut essential services to neighborhoods of color experiencing population loss. By contrast, a group like the People's Development Corporation, or the PDC, grew more out of the Bronx radical tradition. led by Ramon Rueda, the PDC became the national face of sweat equity in the urban homesteading movement in the late 1970s. Rueda had come up with the Young Lords, and he started the PDC in 1974. Basically, the group squatted in the Bronx's burnt-out buildings and rebuilt them as their own homes through what was called sweat equity. This is nothing less than like an exercise in rethinking the property relation and calling forth a new model of housing. And though it's rarely acknowledged, sweat equity, also known as urban homesteading, was a direct inheritor of the Young Lords' politics, using similar tactics like occupation and following the same principles of self-determination. But the group ultimately fell apart just within a few years, a victim basically of its own success, its own high visibility, and its lack of a coherent politics. And sweat equity in general was eclipsed by the similarly named but ideologically distinct Community Development Corporation model, or the CDC, in the late 1970s. CDCs flowered in the arid soil of austerity. Unlike sweat equity groups, they immediately set themselves against the radicalism of their forebears. Their largest funder, the Ford Foundation, put it this way: for many Americans, the mention of community organization conjures up 1960s images of radicals storming City Hall, but one can't very well hurl his body into the path of an oncoming bulldozer when he or she is the developer. So these groups did play a major role in quelling the arson wave, but they claim an ambivalent legacy. I explore how many of the CDCs that emerged to respond to the ravages of landlordism had by the 1990s become the largest landlords in their neighborhoods. But before Bronxites could mobilize against arson in any capacity, they first had to recognize the fires afflicting their neighborhood as arson, right? And specifically as arson for profit. As the KOS Brick series had made clear, that was far from a straightforward task. So I now want to zero in on the question of why. Years before Roberto Ramirez painted Rent Late on his found brick, the painting of a very different canvas offered some insight into why landlord arson was so difficult to identify. One Bronx evening in April 1975, as landlord Imre Oberlander and his associate Ishai Weber were gearing up to torch one of Oberlander's 6 buildings in the South Bronx, they smeared their hands and faces with blackface. By framing their black tenants, the white incendiaries believed that blackface would offer them cover, like a perverse kind of safety gear. At 4 a.m. that Friday morning, the 2 cloaked men cruised down Southern Boulevard en route to the targeted building. They hoped to hide under cover of darkness, but when they drove past a police car, their broken taillight caught the attention of officers on patrol. Pulled over on the wide thoroughfare, they must have known that their cover was blown when their painted faces caught the light of the full moon. Seeing 2 Hasidic men from Williamsburg made up in blackface, one wearing a wig, the officers searched the car. They found 2 firebombs, homemade incendiary devices made from gasoline, gunpowder, and a timing device. Oberlander became one of the first landlords of the decade to be charged with attempted arson in the Bronx. But this was 1975, at the high tide of the New York City fiscal crisis, and the city was understaffed and remarkably unpracticed in recognizing and prosecuting arson for profit. The eyes of the city powerful were so untrained at detecting these kind of telltale signs of arson or arson for profit that despite their crude homemade bombs, the investigators initially thought that they were spies en route to the Soviet diplomatic compound, which was like 10 miles away at the other side of the borough. Of course, this had little to do with Cold War spycraft. What drove the arson wave resided much closer to home, profit. Specifically, in Oberlander's case, it brought $125,000 in insurance payouts for 21 separate fires set between 1970 and 1975. All of his claims were, quote, paid off without a murmur from the insurance company, according to Bronx DA Mario Merola. The fire insurance settlement that was paid to Oberlander without a murmur was paid by the largest property insurer in the Bronx, and that was the New York Fair Plan. This is the public-private insurance program that had been established in 1968 to end redlining. The Fair Plan not only made a habit out of issuing payments without investigating a claim, it was known to vastly overinsure buildings for up to 20 times what they were actually worth. What the story of Oberlander and so many others makes clear is that the hand that torched the Bronx and scores of other cities was that of a landlord, impelled by the market and guided by the state. Importantly, that hand was also, in Oberlander's case, dyed with this dark colorant. Now, it bears asking, who was their audience for this 4 a.m. racial masquerade? Was it the building's tenants, the block's bystanders, or the beat cop? Whomever they imagined their audience to be, they were performing this script of black and brown fire setting that's well rehearsed on the American stage. The figure of the black arsonist in particular is older than the United States itself, haunting the white racial imagination since at least the early 18th century. In the aftermath of the 60s uprisings, this trope was renewed through these like Moynihan frameworks that blamed people for burning down their own neighborhoods, basically. So this is one choice quote from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, then Senator of New York in 1978. People don't want housing in the South Bronx or they wouldn't burn it down. For these two white Hasidic arsonists, there was perceived safety to be found in this racist trope. Blackface worked for them as a framing device, right? The landlord believed that it would indemnify them from getting caught. The irony in their blackface act, of course, is that the two men ended up getting caught precisely because their performance of blackness was both too convincing and too implausible. That is, their apparent blackness likely figured into the officer's decision to pull them over, and their thinly veiled whiteness, upon closer inspection, most definitely prompted the search of the car. I've dwelled in this story at some length, not because landlord arsonists were in the habit of wearing blackface, but rather because most had no need for it. The arson wave was made possible by a complex circuitry of financial masquerade, official neglect, and the presumed criminality of the black and brown Bronxites who were held to blame for the fires. My research shows that instead of blackface, landlords typically donned more cunning disguises, foremost among which was simply hiring paid torches to do the burning for them. By contracting torches, who were typically young men or boys of color living in the immediate vicinity of the targeted buildings, landlords could insulate themselves from getting caught. Thus, torches took on virtually all the risk of arson for profit, receiving in return only a sliver of the rewards. It's worth noting that working as a torch was actually, it was a tough job. Because of the fireproof construction of most Bronx housing, it took much more than a box of matches to destroy a building. As one fire marshal exclaimed, those buildings couldn't have been knocked down by heavy artillery. These hulks of brick and steel and concrete rarely burned down as such. The aim was instead to total them in the eyes of insurance adjusters, right, to inflict maximum monetary damage. And the best way to do so was to compromise the roof, exposing the structure to unwanted entry and to downpours. So it's no coincidence that one of the first hip-hop tracks to reach the charts was born in the Bronx, entitled "The Roof Is on Fire." Importantly, hiring a torch was just one among an ensemble of techniques and forces that all worked together to fan the flames of the arson wave, to obscure its source, and then to redirect the blame onto the tenants of the affected neighborhoods. Counted among that ensemble were real estate lobbyists blaming rent control, politicians and journalists pointing fingers at tenants on welfare, filmmakers dishing out Bronxploitation confections, underwriters flooding cities with this high-cost, low-value insurance access, criminologists hollering about broken windows, lawmakers gutting the fire service, pundits yammering on about riots and pyromaniacs. They all sang this same libelous chorus, drowning out the origins of the arson wave just as surely as Imre Oberlander was framing those whose homes he was destroying. In unison, they cupped their hands around this historically contingent flame. Blackface wasn't necessary when there was such a vibrant tradition of briefcase minstrelsy. In order to capture that chorus in its full range of frequencies, I mined the archives of insurance companies, municipal anti-arson squads, tenant organizations, presidential correspondence, and federal agencies, along with hundreds of oral histories that I and other scholars have collected in the Bronx. I also keep an eye on the cultural responses evoked by the burning of cities. Because the media and the state were so silent about the arson wave until the tail end of the 70s, these cultural productions offer some of the only sources for getting a sense of how ordinary people were making sense of all of this. From Disco Inferno to The Towering Inferno, the 70s and 80s could truly be said to be decades of fire. And in the Bronx, these works played a central role in positioning the borough as a global symbol of the nationwide urban crisis. Over the course of this research, I stumbled upon this vast yet unmarked archive of fire culture, including films like Paul Newman's Fort Apache, The Bronx, and novels like Tom Wolfe's Bonfire, The Vanities. Time and again, Bronxites cried foul against these often degrading representations, their protests manifesting, for instance, in a nationwide effort to shut down the film Fort Apache, The Bronx, which was actually partly successful. But as the fires gained broad recognition throughout the 1970s, the Bronx became fodder for this reactionary law and order politics, often articulated in a liberal grammar. The Bronx, especially its southern end, was reduced to an embodiment of what was being called the urban crisis, and its landscape served as a locus around which fears of racial and national decline congealed. Until the late 60s, areas were known by their neighborhood names, even the name the South Bronx was forged in the fires of these years. So until the late 60s, areas were known by individual names like Monthaven or Melrose. But by the later into the decade, as the fires spread northward, hastening white flight, the name, the South Bronx, followed their path. By the late 70s, nearly the entire southern half of the borough was called the South Bronx. As one journalist put it, when it became the South Bronx was doomed. This protracted scapegoating was actually what inspired the 2019 documentary, Decade of Fire, which, as Dr. Regalado mentioned, you might have seen on PBS, and for which I worked as a researcher. As the film explores the effects of those narratives reverberated far beyond the boundaries of the borough. They materialized, for instance, in the broken windows theory of policing. That theory, which claimed that visual signs of disorder could, in and of themselves, generate crime, was forged out of this now globally circulating image of the burnt-out, broken-windowed Bronx. Its authors, in introducing Broken Windows, deployed the Bronx as a likely fate for all other U.S. cities, one that was only preventable by embracing their new regime of policing. And the authors actually used Palo Alto as the kind of inverse of the Bronx. Literally, that's how it's used in the piece. Even Palo Alto, they wrote, was liable to descend into this Bronx-like lawlessness if their recommendations aren't embraced. So unsettling were the Bronx's actual broken windows that in the early 1980s, the city began installing vinyl decals over them, which depicted a, quote, lived-in look of curtains, shades, shutters, and flower pots. So you can see the trompe-l'oeil flower pot in the top left. These curtains are obviously all fake. These are just decals. They're like metal stickers that are installed over the windows. Not just any broken window received this decal treatment, only those windows that overlooked commuters who were passing through the Bronx on the Cross Bronx Expressway. The top city planner was very open about how the program was really about the outside perception of the Bronx, how it sought to, quote, soften the Bronx's image so people will be willing to invest. So this is a program that was really prioritizing these outside perceptions as seen through its windows over and above the lived experiences of Bronxites who are actually living in these often crumbling structures. For these city planners, the state of the borough's highway-facing windows offered a frame of reference for the borough itself. And in a similar sense, the arson wave writ large offers a frame for parsing the everyday violences produced at this inflection point in racial capitalism. This is to say that the story of landlord arson is offered here not as a cautionary tale of capitalism gone awry or of a few bad apples or of uncaring policymakers or government overreach or of this kind of gritty bygone era in urban history. To frame it as this singular sensational episode of the past is to gloss over its continuities with structures of dominance that are pre-existing and ongoing and quieter and more quotidian. Warning against such spectacularization of black pain, Saidiya Hartman counsels that, quote, shocking displays too easily obfuscate the more mundane and socially endurable forms of terror. But of course, the arson wave is nothing if not a shocking display of violence. The challenge then is to bring that display to bear on the everyday. Like a firework illuminating the anonymous faces of a crowd, the arson wave can render visible those more mundane and socially endurable forms of terror intrinsic to racialized real estate at this historical moment. The method of reading arson as an atlas has an obvious precedent in New York's history, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire that shook the nation in 1911. That fire, which itself was suspected of being incendiary, killed 146 garment workers, mostly women, many doomed to death by the factory owner's policy of keeping the doors and windows locked during working hours. The fire prompted a referendum on working conditions under Fordist modes of industrial production, galvanizing a reform regime that helped bring about the New Deal. Just as Triangle Shirtwaist lays bare the conflicts inherent to industrial capitalism, the arson wave offers a frame of reference for the crises of financial or post-Fordist capitalism. So let me say this another way. The arson wave burst open these contradictions that were mounting in the late 20th century. The resolution of those contradictions didn't evolve into anything as sweeping as the New Deal order, though a number of anti-arson reforms did come to pass. Instead, the story of the arson wave is really one of immiseration struggle and immiseration anew. Of central concern here is how racial ideologies permeated the practices of the aptly named fire industries, finance, insurance, and real estate, which eclipsed manufacturing as the engine of urban economies in the 1970s and 80s. So this is basically a story of financialization from the ground up with race at its center. In mapping, this like seemingly pristine billboard on a burnt out building is advertising a book called The American Economic System, and your part in it, which feels like it also kind of just captures the entire book. So in mapping financialization, another image that unfortunately I was not able to feature in the book. I couldn't get the permissions for it. The book draws heavily from the work of historians and theorists who are tracing the evolution of racial capitalism. Writing in the Black radical tradition, much of that work zeroes in on the period before and after slavery and its immediate or the period of slavery and its immediate aftermath. And there's more and more recent attempts to try to map racial capitalism into the 20th century. My research shows that the condition of possibility for the arson wave was the dynamic interplay between two far-reaching transformations, which are usually understood as discrete and unrelated. On the one hand, the meteoric rise of the fire industries in the 1970s and 80s, and then on the other, the nation's changing racial politics during and after the kind of heyday of the civil rights movement. Building on historian Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's work on predatory inclusion, which she defines as the hope that property ownership could tame the Black rebellion coursing through cities across the country, the project shifts from her focus on homeownership to the rental real estate market and the kind of racialized vicissitudes of insurability. I argue that the advent of this public-private insurance program, the FAIR Plan, marked a real departure from the redlining era, but that its high cost and low value policies, basically subprime policies, left intact the racially stratified structure of the property insurance market. In 1968, the federal government had hoped that by altering the calculus of risk, the FAIR Plan would be able to remedy the racial injustices of the redlining era. But as a financial framework, risk could no more be emptied of racial thinking than property insurance could rectify the inequities of the city. In questions of property, risk and race are like subject and verb. They can't be known apart from each other. The project thus asks, how do we make sense of redlining's afterlives, its enduring sedimented presence in the metropolis, long after the federal government supposedly legislated redlining out of existence? In answering that question, I steer away from what's sometimes called greenlining discourse, which promises to expand the ranks of those considered good risks, and in so doing kind of celebrates access to credit or insurance as the supposed remedy to the racial injustices of the past. I show that access to property insurance on the discriminatory terms of the FAIR Plan crossed the racial cartographies of redlining with the supply glut of greenlining. And just as red and green blend to create brown, I call this process insurance brownlining to capture the sedimented relationship between redlining's residual presence and the FAIR Plan's abrupt infusion of insurance access. A friend recently pointed out that this kind of looks like the MasterCard logo, which, like, I don't know how I feel about that, but I can see it. If all this sounds eerily reminiscent to the lead up to the 2007 subprime loan crisis, that's because what I'm describing here is the deep prehistory to that more recent development. Among the most pressing questions confronting scholars in the wake of the Great Recession has been how finance overtook manufacturing as the driver of the US economy over the last 5 decades. Although this question has spawned a series of excellent studies, you'd be hard-pressed to find terms like race, racism, or redlining in like maybe 2/3 or even 3/4 of these seminal books. By studying the rise of the fire industries from the perspective of poor Black and brown communities, Born in Flames grounds these transformations in the lives of those who felt the deepest shockwaves of financialization. Historians and social scientists don't typically associate a place like the Bronx with the rise of finance. Instead, it's the domain of landscapes like Wall Street or the Loop in Chicago or the City of London. In Saskia Sassen's The Global City, her seminal work on the geographies of financialization, she notes, quote, "Today we see an increased asymmetry. The conditions promoting growth in global cities contain as significant components the decline of other areas of the United States." But this asymmetry sprung up not only between like New York and Detroit, the metropolitan center of finance in the post-industrial periphery. It also materialized within the metropole itself. The where of financialization wasn't limited to lower Manhattan. It was also in Morrisania in the Bronx. And more to the point, it was in the flows between the two. Those flows, I should add, did not obey national borders. The project follows the complex financial circuits that diffuse the cost of arson across a global network of insurance firms. Through a financial technology called reinsurance, each firm was able to pass along some of its liability to other insurance companies, thus reducing its exposure to risk. What emerged was a distinctly post-war triangular trade, offshoring risk from the Bronx to the Caribbean to Britain to Brazil. The hazards confronting a lone tenement of the Bronx thus reverberated over continents and across oceans, redistributing the risks forged in the capital of financialized racial capitalism. Like the triangular trade of earlier centuries, this one also reworked the relationship between race, space, and finance. So it's not just redlining's afterlives that haunt these histories, but slavery's afterlives as well. Those afterlives became apparent to me when I came upon this highly classified 50-page FEMA memorandum that was in a small archive in the Bronx. If you've been wondering why insurers would tolerate these enormous losses to arson, losses again that added up to $15 billion in 1980, this transnational chain of insurers is a big part of that puzzle. Spreading racialized risk across the globe, the insurance mechanism functioned like a years-long wick that put off the actuarial reckoning for another day. Accordingly, I theorize racial finance as itself a form of slow violence in the ecological sense put forward by Rob Nixon, a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that's not typically viewed as violence at all. This was a slow violence that had profound effects on the built in the natural environment and the inhabitants therein, and yet its financial risk was diluted to such a degree that the destruction of the Bronx did not register on the insurance markets of London or Rio for a period of years. Slow violence, I think, helps us make sense of the connections between these earlier conflagrations and those of our present. The recent growth of the California FAIR Plan, along with its counterparts in Florida and Louisiana and many other states, came mostly in the last decade, right? As insurers in these coastal and fire-prone areas began to tremble before the scorched and waterlogged landscapes of our looming and already here catastrophes. What this means is that the climate crisis is effectively being hedged with the same tools invented over 50 years ago to address the urban crisis, to address the rebellions of the 1960s. It's therefore instructive in our current moment to ask how the 1970s blazes were quelled. The firestorm only came to an end because those whose homes lay in its path built up their tenant power and brought it to bear upon their legislators, landlords, and lenders. I want to conclude with one such tenant, Genevieve Brooks, who moved to the area around Crotona Park in the early 1960s. She soon watched a white flight ravage the neighborhood, so she tried to stabilize her building by organizing a tenant association, only to find that her task was impossible because her whole block was bottoming out. So she organized a block association and found that the most dedicated volunteers were the children in the now mostly Black and Latinx neighborhood. It's always some kids, she recalled. You know, you can do a lot with some kids. Noticing the demand for youth-oriented programming, she organized a daycare center called the Seabury Daycare Center in 1970 with funding from the Federal Model Cities program. Soon after that, the fires began in her neighborhood. Brooks viewed the blazes through the eyes of the children who were in her care, who, quote, were not able to have a good night's sleep. And this was a common affliction. Parents were actually in the habit of dressing their children in their day clothes and putting their shoes on before they went to bed so that they could get up and escape quickly. I saw that almost 10 times in the archive. Worried about the children, Brooks kept her ear to the ground and heard rumors that it was landlords who were setting the fires. In 1973, she approached the fire department with her suspicions, but she hit a wall. Quote, the fire marshals insisted that it was the junkies or someone starting the fires. Where others would have been discouraged, Brooks met gaslighting with organizing. She created the first of the city's dozens of community anti-arson organizations, and she did this under the unlikely auspices of a daycare center. The fire program at Seabury Daycare documented the blazes plaguing the immediate blocks surrounding the building, counting 56 separate fires in a single 2-week stretch. She brought this data to the major players in Bronx politics, but was once more brushed aside. So she decided to create a anti-arson public education campaign. She created posters with slogans that were composed by the children at Seabury Daycare, and the children then installed them all over the neighborhood. Brooks was ultimately at the forefront of what would become a nationwide anti-arson movement. But as a Black woman and a tenant taking on the borough's property owners and power brokers, it would take her years to gain the solid footing needed to punch up in the direction of the borough's elite. In the meantime, there was little to suggest that the arson wave would be recognized as such by those in power, unless you knew where to look. Buried on the 16th page of the September 2nd, 1974 New York Times, the first in a slew of municipal anti-arson task forces was quietly announced, and this was just a few weeks after the poster campaign. This effort was short-lived, but with continued pressure from below, from the likes of Genevieve Brooks, the state did eventually intervene. The fires would only subside when the profit was taken out of arson, and that required the end of brownlining. It took persistent years of organizing to force the state to then hold the fire industries to account, but it's worth remembering that this whole saga began in 1973 when Genevieve Brooks asked this same originary question voiced by the kids of survival: why are there so many fires? It's a question that, as we've seen, lifts well above its weight in the history of capitalism and the built environment, and to answer it means taking seriously how the urban order was born in flames. So thank y'all, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Ansfield. That was really special. we have plenty of time for questions, and I'll take the questions and Bench will answer them. Folks?
So I was kind of struck by the map that you showed very early. I mean, I buy the argument that it's kind of a low cost, well, not low cost, but kind of crude way of doing gentrification and urban renewal. And I can think of, I can think of lots of places on that map where that story fits. But I'm kind of struck that it's much broader than that.
Yeah.
So this is clearly a chapter of this, but what about the insurance itself? Because obviously, on the one hand, if you don't provide that insurance and it's a wildfire or it's an accidental fire, it's not an insurance fire, then you have lots of people that are devastated and no way of coming back. On the other hand, you have the incentive problem that you're talking about, that it can lead either to people being a little sloppy about how they maintain their properties or their homes. So tell me a little bit about what else is going on around the country. Did you find that it was always the racial areas, or was it something else that led to, because a lot of these areas do not have large African-American populations, don't even have urban areas, and you're finding, that they too were subject to this. So talk a little bit about that. What do we know about outside of New York, what was going on in these areas that weren't so racialized? Or were they? Was it all in the Latino neighborhoods? I don't know. What did you find?
Yeah, so the plan was like statutorily for riot-prone areas. That's how it was rolled out. That was how its mission was defined. That definition was interpreted in very different ways across the U.S. Every state, every place has like a high-risk market of some sort. The insurance industry refers to it as the residual market. It usually maps almost perfectly onto neighborhoods home to poor communities of color, but not always. And so in most of these states, that is indeed where fair plan rollout happens. But not actually all of these states end up having a fair plan. The adoption happens on a state-by-state basis. And I think, it doesn't have a year. In like the mid-1970s, 26 or 27 states had fair plans implemented. Those states that didn't have fair plans were the ones without anti-arson forces. And even those states that didn't have fair plans, that did in fact have, suffer from high arson rates, the creation of these fair plans ends up stimulating the residual market, even in states that don't have a fair plan. And those, instead of the fair plan operating in those specific geographies that had been redlined, instead what's called the excess in surplus insurance market it does that work, and which is basically like the unregulated market. So the fair plan in a weird way ends up like inflating the size of the residual market on a nationwide scale, even where it's not operating.
I get that part, but so then what does the anti-arson organizations, how are they effective? Is it because neighbors are paying more attention to it? Or was it because it led to some sort of reform in the insurance market, so they became more skeptical? What is it that is the mechanism by which the anti-arson organizations had something to do with the termination of this period?
Yeah, of course. It's an umbrella term, so there are so many different strategies used. I mean, some of these are like almost like predecessors to ACORN type of organizations, and others are like collaborations between police and fire departments. It really runs the gamut. The techniques that ended up making the most difference were tenant and block associations, mostly, that would put landlords on notice, and they often worked within the municipal bureaucracy so that tenants could notice when a building seemed especially prone or at risk, and then the city would follow up with a letter or stationing police cars to let landlords know that they couldn't operate with impunity. By the early 1980s, they developed early warning software thanks to tenant data, and that's able to predict with like kind of incredible accuracy what buildings are going to be targeted for arson. Like in New York, it's almost at 80%. It can predict, and all of that data is again coming from the like tenant level, but they can't operate on it without cooperation from the state. So for the first half of the 70s, tenant organizations are desperately trying to hold the fire line, basically, because it advanced in, like, especially in the Bronx, in like a geographical pattern. Like you could see it coming over the course of years, and so which obviously presented an organizing opportunity to try to like literally hold the line, but it was very difficult to do so without simultaneous action from the state. So in the case of the Bronx, the city organizes something called the Arson Strike Force in 1978, and that is decisive. Yeah.
Can I follow up on the first question? It strikes me that unlike in the 1930s when the federal government is developing the Federal Housing Authority, that this isn't this isn't a federal plan, that it's state by state. Can you say a little bit about like why that's the case? Like why is it that a place like Nebraska, because I would imagine that the real estate companies, like many builders and banks, as in the 1930s, would have seen this as just like, okay, it's free money because it's the federal government backing it regardless of what happens.
Yeah, so the insurance industry is almost like singular in its escape of New Deal regulations. So the insurance industry for most of the 20th century, with the exception of like 1 year between 1944 and 45, is regulated on a state-based level. And this is why when you have health insurance in California and you want to be seen by a doctor in Oregon, you can't make it happen because insurance is always regulated on a state-based level. Insurers will do anything to maintain that, to escape federal regulation. That's like the number one priority always. So anytime insurers consent to any sort of regulatory measure, it's always to ward off more stringent regulation. Their like greatest fear is the overturning of what's called the McCarran-Ferguson Act from 1945. And so in the case of the FAIR plans, they adopt this particular reform as a way to kind of ward off more stringent regulation that would threaten to, because community groups were actually calling for the overturning of the McCarran-Ferguson Act. Like they understood that because the federal government had so little power to actually regulate insurance companies, that that was the first thing that needed to go in order to like force the federal government to get involved. And insurers would do anything to stop that. That's why you get them eventually trying to repair their reputation with, I'm trying to pull up that Travelers. I must have skipped it. Whatever, that Travelers ad, right? Like Aetna does the same thing. They publish a bunch of advertisements about the arson problem and try to like soup themselves up as like making the difference in stopping this and kind of victimizing themselves in the story. Yeah.
Other folks? I think gentleman in the corner.
Yeah. So obviously the landlords are benefiting massively from these fair plans, but I was also wondering, you referenced the broken windows theory.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, kind of in the context of, the landlords kind of, destroying their own units. I was wondering how that maybe, affects other units they had in the same area, because in my mind, destroying your own units would then maybe cause some disinvestment, which maybe leads to less encouragement for other people to move into the South Bronx. So was this maybe a positive feedback loop kind of happening, or was it such that maybe the landlords just were benefiting so much from the fair plan that it was negligible?
Yeah, so the arson wave is basically the like conclusion of the disinvestment process, right? Which had been happening so the peak year of arsons is 1976 nationally and in the Bronx, and by that point, most landlords, like unless they were like actually bad actors, were trying to get out from under those properties. and this was the easiest way to do so. There were like all of these kind of organized crime type of arson rings that then would try to attain the ownership of those properties, so then they could actually force them through this insurance fraud themselves. But by the middle of the 70s, most landlords were trying to get out from them. The broken windows theory doesn't come about. The article's not published until '82, and it's not really implemented on like in New York at least until the early 90s. So it takes a while for it kind of comes out of this history, but it's not actually. It doesn't actually. At the point at which broken windows was being written about, the most famous police precinct in the Bronx, which had been called Fort Apache, it's part of the reason that this film is called Fort Apache, the Bronx, was going by the name Little House on the Prairie because it was actually doing so little. It was like shows like how much of a difference the broken windows orientation made in terms of policing in the city. But that, again, doesn't really roll out until the early 90s under Giuliani. Yeah.
I was wondering a little bit about the lasting effects of these fires in the communities who lived them. And I was struck by the story you started with the painted bricks. And I wondered if you came across any sort of art in more recent years or oral histories or just sort of stories from the community about how this period affected them.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, Decade of Fire is a really good example of that. That's the film. In that's basically a community production. It's produced by this woman, Vivian Vasquez, who lived through this history in the 70s. Internalized some of the like scapegoating messaging and thought it was just like her community burning down their own buildings, didn't really understand it, and ends up making the film as a way to it's like a truth seeking for herself, but then also for her community, and it's been such an asset in the Bronx. Like it's been integrated into K through 12 curricula. It's shown, every community group has probably had a screening by this point. But in general, the kind of long shadow of these fires still it very much haunts the Bronx. The borough didn't really, and we were talking about this yesterday a bit in the Black and Otherwise Geographies group, that the borough didn't really face gentrification threats that were, they didn't get to there were a lot of whispers of gentrification is coming throughout the early aughts, but not really until the middle of the 2010s does gentrification arrive in the Bronx. And when it does, it bizarrely takes the form of kind of co-opting and commodifying this history, and actually the history of the arsons becomes a selling point for these major new condo developments that are built. The clearest example of this is this hundreds of $1 million development in Port Morris, the very southern tip of the Bronx. Has this big party to celebrate the opening of this development in 2015, and it's literally Bronx is Burning themed. And Adrian Brody comes, Kendall Jenner, Naomi Watts. It's an A-list party. People are busting from Manhattan and Brooklyn. People are tweeting. The hashtag is Bronx is Burning. There's trash can fires and bullet riddled cars, and there's actually a room of just fallen bricks in a way that's a weird, eerie, I don't know. It's just they're not thinking of the KOS brick series, but I am at least. And it's very much riding on the coattails of hip hop. Baz Luhrmann is there, and he's about to make The Get Down, which is his series about the birth of hip hop in the Bronx in the 70s. It ends up being used against, or long-term residents are really offended by this party. There's a lot of protests. And then you get these groups that are forming like against the threat of gentrification throughout the 20-teens. And they use their own communities or their own personal survivorship of this history as like to stake a claim on the borough and to like assert a right to remain. So they're literally saying like, we survived the this horrible epochal decade-long fire wave. We stayed. We should have no risk of being displaced now. Now that like suddenly the like tide of disinvestment is turning. And I like think about this as a form of threat equity, like in like recalling the sweat equity as like, we survived these threats in the past. We have a form of equity. We have a sense of belonging that comes from that survivorship, and that like like these assertions of a right to remain are kind of formulated through that discourse. And they're the kinds of mobilizations that they do, and which are often like very creative and involve a lot of like community arts, are really like wrapped up in like there's many depictions of this history in that as like a way to assert their sense of place. Yeah.
This has been absolutely fascinating. I have a couple questions that are just practical questions, then I have one larger question about fire in existence. First, so you said, how difficult is it to actually make an incendiary device like this that would be used here? And when you said that it was always this sort of top floors, why is that exactly?
Yeah.
Is it because of the way the structures are happening here? Am I right about that?
It's a very strange thing. So the trade secret was to try to set what was called the cockloft on fire, which is like the recess in between the ceiling of the top floor and the roof, because one, again, damaging the roof was the most costly thing that you could do to a building, but also it was the least likely to get anybody hurt. Like people in the lower floors would be able to escape easier. And landlords, very few people died in all these years, at least in the Bronx. I mean, people did die, but like compared to how many fires there were, clearly landlords were trying to avoid that and had all sorts of techniques to alert people beforehand. Sometimes by setting a small fire that was clearly not intended to spread as like a warning shot, and often the cockloft fire would be that. And it would require like multiple fires to like actually, set over the course of weeks to like total the building.
But there was like also among the torches a craft of sorts.
Yes.
Right. Like
100%.
a skilled.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I like think of them as like the demolition workers of the informal economy, and there were like, I read about one torch who had set over 20 fires and was still considered an apprentice. So like it was really, and people had their own trade secrets in terms of how they would do this. Some would, some would like use kind of kerosene-soaked clothing as like a wick, so that they could, escape the building before anything really got set on fire. Some would, blow out pilot lights and then allow the gas fumes to fill the building, and then have a spark on the top floor. People did often, most likely people to get hurt were torches and firefighters, because it was really dangerous work. Yeah.
On this, it's interesting that not that many people died, considering the sort of extent of the damage too. But I'm not from California, but now I've lived here for 8 years. My experience of insurance in California, fire insurance, is they are extremely zealous. Like I have to get a new plan every year. It gets more and more expensive.
Yeah.
And they're basically trying to get people, they're trying to win the state for many different reasons, and not just this state. And I read about the history of life insurance, which seems also, that there's actuaries, they collect data. This is the literal basis of what they are doing, and how they make money and how they predict risk and all of these things. And I'm curious with the sort of pushback from the insurance companies themselves, because it makes it sort of is basically just reinsurance the reason why that they just don't care that much, and they think this is a sunk cost anyways. The Bronx, they don't care. This is fire's going to take up basically they're not really doing business there anyways, so they don't care about it. And is this lingered to today? So is it possible? I mean, has this impacted the insurance market in the Bronx even still? Actually, so that like there is a risk premium that's been put in place there or elsewhere.
So it's even bigger than reinsurance. It's actually, and this is like where the financialization story comes in. So in the 70s, the entire like profit structure of the industry morphs because of high interest rates and just the trending financialization of the time. Up until the 70s, really, or the late 60s, the property insurance industry's like the profits were all structured by the loss ratio, like the ratio of losses paid out to premiums earned. Like that was the like sacrosanct, like it all hinged on that. In the 70s, it became much more complicated, where insurance companies began to turn most of their profits from their investments, and the question of the loss ratio began to lose its relevance, at least for a brief period, because interest rates were so high, because they were making so much money on the money markets and the real estate investments. They just needed to keep up the churn of premium dollars as a way to keep their money going into their investments, right? So it didn't actually matter to them that they were losing money on the underwriting side, because they were making so much more money back from their investments. So that's like the biggest piece. The reinsurance was a way to offset those losses, but the losses they were okay with. The other aspect, just in terms of the FAIR Plan, is FAIR Plans were pools of all registered insurers operating in a given state. So like who were forced to participate. So they knew that any loss that they were taking, the private companies that made up this pool, like Aetna, knew that it was losing $500,000 a year or something, because its losses were proportionate with its share of the statewide market. So like it's Aetna, maybe say in New York, represented maybe 8% of the New York market. So let's say they lost $500,000 in 1977. They knew that the Hartford was also losing a proportionate amount of money. Like all of their competitors were equally at a disadvantage in a way that like made it more palatable, especially because again these were like the most profitable years for property insurers throughout the 20th century. Like they were doing great, so they were okay with it.
And sorry, one look, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was the Armstrong Commission, which was about life insurance. Again, was there ever kind of like this kind of moment for, and we're not just talking about fire insurance. I would imagine this is property insurance. This is like this is a
Exactly.
homeowner's insurance, correct?
And casualty, yeah, it's yeah. Nothing like the Armstrong Commission. Yeah, there was something called the Merrill Commission that was around, but it didn't make the same kind of waves and didn't instill as much fear in them. Interesting, around that same time, there was a different arson wave in the 19 teens and 20s that were mostly also blamed on Jewish landlords. Colson Whitehead writes about this in his latest novel, and this is a lot of the dynamics here are like just that story on a grander scale, but with a different set of financial mechanisms at play.
I think we've got someone back there, and then in the back.
So I had two questions. So the first one was about, you mentioned that the community corporations that were started to oppose the arson wave became some of the biggest landlords in the South Bronx, which I found really striking.
Yeah.
And it feels really like it ties into this broader sort of thread of literature that talks about this era of community control and community empowerment, then sort of morphing into something which is somewhat predatory, or sort of latch onto these economies of racial capitalism that emerged in the late 20th century.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask more about those corporations and how you sort of see them as fitting into that broader schema. And the second question I had was, you mentioned Rob Nixon's slow violence, and it's interesting because I feel like his argument is so rooted in environmentalism, and so it got me thinking: were these anti-arson organizations and these Black and Latino activists that were sort of fighting this wave, were they thinking about, or at least were they articulating a sort of language of resistance that was about environmentalism and about, for example, like asbestos, right? That's coming from these fires, different form, like exposure to different forms of hazardous materials. Like, in what ways were those sorts of campaigns against like exposure to toxic materials part of this opposition to arson?
Yeah, great questions. So the kind of the story of the Community Development Corporation and the CDC is like that's the story of affordable housing post 1973 and Nixon shutting down public housing. Like most of the affordable housing that's been built in the country since the early 70s has been through CDCs, which, you know, almost like charter schools run the gamut ideologically. Like some of them are really kind of like staying true to the origins of these groups, which are kind of in the early 70s at least, often like directly linked, like involving the same exact people who were involved in the Young Wars, who were involved in kind of this national liberationist moment. But especially when you get this kind of like, when you see the evolution from like first sweat equity and homesteading, then to CDCs, the Ford Foundation calls it corrective capitalism, and it really functions like that. They end up becoming whatever, like they're overall, to whatever extent you can generalize, they become very invested in the property relation. They're, you know, by the time Reagan comes into the White House, they are like ready to pounce on this kind of like the void created by like the austerity at all levels of government. And LIHTC, which is still the low-income housing tax credit, is still like the mechanism by which affordable housing is mostly produced. And CDCs benefit from this by basically selling tax abatements, using their nonprofit status to sell tax abatements to investors. And so it is, you know, there are still CDCs that like are really like connected to their mission, and it's still like and absolutely manage their properties in ways much more responsible than you know their surrounding neighbors. But for everyone that like is actually a responsible landlord, there's another that is just, you know, basically again to the charter school, like they're you know, bordering on predatory. The environmental question is really interesting because the anti-arson groups, not so much. They didn't frame their work so much as connected to environmental justice at all. But that group, the Bronx Frontier that I mentioned, that creates the compost that they sell at Bloomingdale's. Zudu, yeah. They're trying to install solar panels throughout the Bronx. And the 70s has this moment of solar power like promise. Jimmy Carter installs them in the White House, and Reagan dismantles the solar panels when he comes in. And they're very upfront about connecting I do hesitate to call it environmental justice at this point because it's literally run by a former cop who is like kind of playing into the planned shrinkage designs for the Bronx in these years. Like this is in a way that will kind of echo in New Orleans post Katrina. There's this like the idea of like creating like a green belt, or like what do we do with all this land that has been ravaged by disinvestment? Let's just turn it into prairies. Like that's like very much the designs here, and they're like part of this environment of the anti-arson movement, but they're also like somewhat controversial and like have a lot of enemies. Yeah, so it's prior to the like formal organization of environmental justice, which is like comes out of, or people, most historians trace it to the 80s moment in the U.S. But they're confronting a similar set of conditions. Yeah.
We've got time for maybe one more. I think maybe in the corner.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have two kind of related questions that my understanding is that at the same time as kind of New York was going bankrupt, there was this real crisis around the image of the city and trying to attract real estate investment from abroad. And so there was like the leaking of welfare coffers to transfer that money into like the I Heart New York City or the Big Apple campaigns, like that kind of image rebrand situation. And so as such, my two questions are, firstly, could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between organizers in the Bronx and then organizers around the arson politics in Brooklyn, and whether there was a kind of trans city coalescing around this arson politics and evacuations and such? And then secondly, just like a little bit more about what kinds of fears this arson epidemic engendered amongst New York City elites writ large around their real existential need to attract more investment, and how that was kind of jarring up with their I Heart New York City campaign when you have like so much fire going on in the city. But yeah, if you, that would be amazing. Thank you so much for the talk. It was super interesting.
Yeah. Let me do the elites first. They were obviously like in the Bronx, people like city staffers were not allowed to say Bronx and burning in the same sentence, like all throughout the 80s and 90s. Like it was like seen as absolutely detrimental to the image crisis problem. Interestingly, one of the guys who helps implement the I Heart New York campaign is the publicist for Fort Apache, the Bronx. And so, like, because there's so much community opposition to the film, he actually like creates this AstroTurf protest where he pays all these, the CAFA, the Committee Against Fort Apache, gets William Kunstler, very famous movement lawyer, to bring a lawsuit on their behalf to get a judicial injunction against the film. And they're holding a rally in front of the courthouse steps, and then all of a sudden, like 60 or 70 like youth from the Bronx show up saying, denouncing CAFA and saying like this film is good for our community, like we need this film. And the CAFA organizers are perplexed, and they go up to the kids and they're like, "What are you doing? Why are you here?" And they're like, and they like immediately confess to like being paid $15 and being promised lunch. Like literally, that was the promise. And so the CAFA organizers show the counter protesters copies of the script and like explain like how degrading the representation is of the Bronx, and they like immediately switch sides and like start join the CAFA protest. And then this I Heart New York dude, like almost on cue, like gets out of a taxi, and then they all just start chasing him in front of the federal courthouse, and he like escapes by getting in another taxi, but it's like horrible publicity. And so, and what's hilarious about, or like particularly ironic about all this, is like the reason that there's filmmakers making movies in New York is like the image crisis people, like the elites, are trying to like recuperate the homegrown Hollywood. Like they're trying to get back to like 1920s filmmaking in New York City by sponsoring and giving tax abatements to these films. And then the films that are being made are like totally, these like New York exploitation type films. And so like many of the kind of image crisis initiatives kind of end up making matters worse for themselves. I'm forgetting the other half.
All about like Bronx and Brooklyn.
Oh yes, 100%. They trained each other. The People's Firehouse came to the Bronx. Northwest Bronx Community Encouragement Coalition went to Brooklyn. Once the Arson Strike Force was organized in 1978, there's like a formalized like organizing ecosystem that is actually getting funded by the city to do anti-arson work and to train other neighborhoods and organize. And like by the early 80s, there are dozens of organizations just in the Bronx. There's at least a dozen in Brooklyn. They're really taking off on a very micro neighborhood scale and training each other to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's many questions.